It's the week ending Saturday, the 25th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the leader of the House of Commons resign over Brexit, Huawei's smartphone business face serious implications after Google blocked its Android license, and Nigel Farage having a milkshake thrown at him during his campaign in Newcastle. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Holden, Frith, Rebecca, Gillie, and we've run out of weird introductions for Felicity, Capon from the Week Junior. And starting the show this week, it's Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
In disaster-stricken Yemen, one industry is booming.
They chew it here, they chew it there, they chew it pretty much everywhere. Yemeni studies show that up to 90% of men and 70% of women are daily users of khat. It has an effect similar to amphetamines, and amid dire predictions of famine in Yemen, it's the nation's biggest crop.
Sam Riley there reporting for CNN. Rebecca, we're talking about crops.
Yeah, we're talking about crops in Yemen, specifically khat, which, as we just heard, is it's a stimulant. It's a plant leaf which is chewed by the vast majority of the adult population in Yemen and by quite a significant amount of the child population as well.
And quite a lot of expats, for want of a better phrase, immigrants to this country try and find it, don't they?
Yeah, so it's not only chewed in Yemen, it's also in lots of the Horn of Africa's countries like Somalia, Kenya, and in the diaspora of those communities as well. The reason it's been in the news in relation to Yemen this week is that it currently takes up around 60% of Yemen's fertile land is given over to growing khat, and about a third of its fresh water is used to irrigate khat. And as you probably know, Yemen is currently suffering a serious humanitarian crisis as a result of the ongoing civil war, and about 40% of the country's population is at risk of starvation.
So there seems to be an obvious irony, I guess, that the population is starving, but they're chewing khat, and if they just didn't grow the drug that they don't need, they could have the food that they do.
Yeah, so that's one thing that has been kind of a sticking point between the international community and both the Yemeni governments, the official government and the Houthi rebel government that controls large parts of the northwest of the country. And so humanitarian aid has been in the news this week because the UN is saying that so much of the food aid is being redirected, which is kind of polite slang for stolen, by the Houthi commanders, that they are considering phasing out supplying humanitarian aid. So the problem could be about to get worse.
But the thing is, Holden, if you're a farmer in Yemen and you can make more profit out of growing khat than you can out of growing food, you presumably are not starving. So the issue for you about the country being on the brink of starvation isn't a reality. The reality is you will make more money by growing this crop. I mean, it's quite hard to remove that human nature, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's no incentive at all to tear up a crop where there's a reliable demand for it and replace it with something that will take a lot of time to establish and may yield less profit. The other side of it is that part of the reason that so many Yemenis do use khat is that one of the effects is that it suppresses hunger. So there's actually a bit of a vicious circle here, in that the hungrier people are, the more demand there is for this crop, which then takes up more of the land that could be used for growing food.
And how serious a drug is it, actually? I mean, is it banned in this country? I don't even know what the status is.
It was banned here relatively recently, I think 2014. It had essentially escaped official attention. And it was then a campaign by the Somali community here to get it outlawed because they thought it was doing damage to them.
But it's not a seriously addictive drug. And I think it has been used culturally for absolutely centuries at, gets-togethers and things like that. It can affect your sleep. I think you can have hallucinations. And I think if you're genetically predisposed to some things, it can, have worse effects. But it's not like a really, really super serious drug.
It was made a Class C drug, and it was actually banned against the recommendation of the medical report that the Home Office commissioned. They said essentially there's no evidence of serious harm, but Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, banned it in part because she wanted to bring UK law into line with EU law, which had a lot of other EU countries had banned khat about at the same time, and she didn't want the UK to end up being a kind of hub for trafficking it.
And Felicity, do you think it's fair that these sets of statistics are in our eye line at the moment? People starving versus people chewing khat.
I think there's a very worrying, simplistic conclusion, and I'm sure so many people would jump on this to say, why are we sending aid to countries like this when they could just be growing, crops to feed themselves? But I think there's so many things that beneath the surface that's not quite right. I mean, as Holden was saying, it's so much easier to grow khat than it is to grow food. If you think about, I mean, it's basically, my very limited understanding is it's almost a bit like a weed. It will just sort of grow anywhere. Whereas, food, if you were going to grow crops in intensive farming, that takes a lot of effort, a lot of money. Also, farmers of the crop, they can collect leaf crops 3 to 4 times a year, whereas coffee tree, for example, only produces 1 seed crop a year. So there's a lot sort of going on beneath the surface. And also, I mean, flip me, if I was in Yemen, I would definitely be taking drugs. Drugs are a form of escapism from life's problems. And if any country on the planet, if you want to get away from the everyday horrors of your life, Yemen's probably where you're going to be taking drugs. So I think just, give them a break. And some aid.
I mean, yes, that's true, isn't it, Rebecca? If you look at, the proportion of people involved, for example, in the Blitz here, I mean, I know smoking was a thing then, but certainly everyone was smoking then pretty much. And, people in stressful jobs now, people doing manual labour, it's typical, isn't it, that you're more likely to smoke in this country. Can we equate that with khat over there?
The health effects are probably somewhat comparable. I mean, khat can cause some serious conditions, liver damage, cardiovascular disease, and its actual effects on users has been compared to drinking really strong coffee all day. So it's not, it's not the most dangerous drug. And as Felicity was saying, in the current crisis, it's understandable why people would resort to it. One factor as well, while it might be easy to make that link between starvation and the lack of agriculture, in reality, Yemen can't feed itself. Even if all of the farmland that's currently being used to grow khat was being used to grow crops, the country is still incapable of supporting itself. There's just not enough fertile farmland. This could be used really as a bit of a smokescreen. The real issue is, and always has been, the Saudi-led coalition blocking the import of food, which Yemen has always relied upon for its food supplies.
And is that really why you've chosen it as your story of the week? Because it highlights that?
Yeah, I think it's an issue that the crisis in Yemen hasn't got the kind of attention it deserves. I mean, you do read about it in the paper. It's not like it's underreported necessarily.
No, but you ask someone in a pub to give a simple 2-line definition of what's happening and they'd struggle, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and yet it is the biggest humanitarian crisis going on in the world, and there are 12 million people at risk of starvation. And the danger with stories like this is that, as we've discussed, people could jump to the conclusion of, well, why are we spending this money? It's in the region of $175 million a month is being spent essentially feeding 12 million people by the international community. But I think it's worth keeping sight of the fact that the coalition blockade is the real issue. And actually, I think that the real problem of khat consumption is going to be not on food supplies, but on the economy. At the moment, the Yemen economy is basically in tatters. People can't really work because there's no importing or exporting. And the khat consumption takes up a phenomenal amount of economic resources and everyday workers' time. Every morning, this gigantic khat gathering economy, people are rushing out in trucks to harvest it because it wilts within a day. So then they rush it all into the towns. Everyone then rushes to the marketplace at lunchtime to buy themselves a bag and then spend the afternoon, sitting around chewing it, and it's part of the lifestyle. But at the same time, if the economy is going to rebuild in the future, I think that is where the khat consumption is going to prove a bit of an obstacle.
Holden.
Olly, you mentioned earlier the Blitz in passing, and there's actually an odd parallel with Nazi Germany here, where stimulants were also widely used throughout society. Crystal meth, marketed as Pervitin, was widely sold in pill form and actually added to chocolate bars too, in quite significant doses, and these were just widely consumed throughout society. I was going to say it took a sinister turn, but that's as so often with the Nazis. There was not a happy ending to this story. At the outbreak of the Second World War, the army got hold of this idea of essentially using crystal meth to suppress fear and also to suppress fatigue. And so soldiers who were invading Poland, Belgium and France were pumped full of huge amounts of amphetamines to just sort of keep them driving forward across Europe.
Yeah, no, that actually, Houthi rebel commanders have been using it as a substitute for money to pay their soldiers. So it is still, the stimulants are still being used in that function.
And isn't it also keeping roads open across enemy lines? Because everyone's just, regardless of which side of the conflict you're on, you're all taking this drug. But I couldn't quite work out
whether... So there's a good argument for khat.
I couldn't work out that was a good thing or a bad thing.
So what else could you get across the road, you mean?
Well, I suppose in a way I was like, yay, the roads are open, that's great. But then I was like, I don't know, it just struck me as...
If you could use the distribution network and the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that has been put into khat for some sort of economic and social good,
yes, exactly,
then that might actually... that might be the only infrastructure that remains operational in Yemen.
Well, I suppose it's something that keeps them all Yemeni citizens, isn't it? Despite the fact they're fighting each other. I mean, that is maybe an equaliser, whether the roads are open or not. Yeah, it's the equivalent of, the World War I soldiers singing Silent Night, isn't it, on Christmas Day?
There is actually starting to become a large anti-khat movement in Yemen as well. A lot of people are saying that if we're going to pull the country back together, we basically need to shake this habit because it's incredibly destructive to the economy. Then they also particularly focus on the amount of children using it. I think it's like 1 in 5 under 12s choose khat every day. So it's going to be a problem that goes into the future as well.
Okay, Holden, you're up next after this. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
From now on, if you want to make a Swiss roll, you can take his gun away first.
America loves guns. Hell, I love guns, but I also hate guns.
Another mass shooting in America.
Another mass shooting.
Yet another mass shooting.
So I was wondering, what if there was a world where people could keep their guns and have no mass shootings? Welcome to Switzerland, a neutral country most known for its cobblestone streets perfect for skipping, its clocks, sophisticated pocket knives, and guns. Turns out peaceful Switzerland is one of the most heavily armed nations in the world. And like America, they love their guns.
Michael Costa there reporting for The Daily Show. Holden, Switzerland's gun laws, what were they and what are they now?
They were the most permissive gun laws in Europe, and they probably still are, but they're just a little bit tighter than they were. But this is a big change, partly because Switzerland does have such a deep-rooted culture of gun ownership.
Okay, so what's happened?
There was a referendum. What's more, it was a referendum.
I've heard of those.
It was a referendum that pitted the Swiss government and the EU and liberal metropolitan types against more conservative rural defenders of traditional Swiss way of life. But in this case, it was actually the metropolitan elites who came out on top, and the government persuaded more than 63% of Swiss citizens to back its plans to outlaw certain semi-automatic weapons.
But this wasn't just because they didn't want as many guns in the country, was it? It was because there would be punitive measures from the EU if they didn't. Maybe they couldn't be part of Schengen anymore, so it would take a hit for them economically.
That's right, yeah. It all ties into Switzerland's fairly complicated relationship with the rest of Europe. So it's not a member of the EU, but it is a member of the Schengen Agreement, which allows passportless travel between a lot of mainland Europe. And since the terrorist attacks in France in 2015, the EU has been introducing sort of minimum standards for gun controls throughout the Schengen Agreement. And so if Switzerland hadn't passed these laws, it would have been ejected from that agreement and it would have had to reintroduce border controls. The Swiss government said that would be damaging to tourism and trade and the economy more widely.
Okay, looking around the casting in the room today, I'm not going to even ask if any of you think that the public should have rejected the government's proposal and allowed everyone to keep their guns and have more guns. But nonetheless, as Holden says, there are perhaps still more guns in Switzerland than in other European countries now, even after this referendum result. And there are still, very strong views on gun ownership and low levels of gun crime. What can we learn from Switzerland, Felicity?
Really strong views on gun ownership, which I hadn't realised at all. So that's what I've learnt. But they have, this referendum is kind of definitely a turning point, because back in 2011, there was a referendum motion which called for all militia firearms to be stored in public arsenals and for national gun registry to be established. And 56.3% of voters were opposed to the idea. So that's definitely marks a change. But to many traditionalists, a gun kind of symbolised an independent, well-fortified Switzerland that's kind of kept them out of 2 world wars. And I was reading that they sort of have a very different, I don't know if this is true or not, but a different sort of cultural mindset to, say, the Americans. So the Americans have their weapons for self-defense and it's to protect them, and they're a bit trigger-happy. Whereas the Swiss, I was reading a quote from someone who's saying it's a piece of sports equipment. The relationship to the weapon is completely different. No one feels like they need to shoot a robber with this weapon. So that's maybe the difference.
So how do we echo
that
in the rest of Europe? How do we get people to feel like their guns are a piece of sports equipment?
The thing is that Switzerland is a very small and homogenous and wealthy country in comparison to, most other countries around the world. So they have they have quite a unified national culture, and part of that is the idea that owning a gun is, as Felicity was saying, in America, you're kind of owning it in the back of your head to protect you from the government, whereas in Switzerland, it's more like a patriotic duty in case Switzerland ever needed to defend itself. But at the same time, there's a massive culture of gun safety as well. You have to be able to demonstrate you can use a gun safely before you're allowed to purchase a weapon. And there's a strong cultural pressure to store your gun safely, to use it safely, and to teach your children how to use them safely as well.
I don't know if this is still correct, but Swiss Army guns are issued to all Swiss men of fighting age. And I think if you do serve, you then get to keep your gun after. So it seems like completely ingrained. And I think there's more of a culture of taking children along to shooting ranges for target practice and that sort of thing.
I think one of the interesting things here is that the US culture and Swiss culture actually had very similar origins, in that it was about the fact that their armies consisted of local militias which could be called up as and when necessary. But in the US, that has sort of morphed into this free-for-all in which almost anyone can have almost any weapon. But Switzerland's kept that sort of sense of military discipline and responsibility alongside the rights. So all able-bodied Swiss men, when they reach the age of 18, have to spend 21 weeks in the army, and then they have to spend another 21 weeks before the age of 34, split up into other periods. And most of the weapons in circulation are military-issue weapons that then have to be stored. The ammunition is supplied by the Swiss army too. There's much more of a sort of structure around weapon ownership. There are still some wrinkles in Switzerland general sort of low crime status. So its murder rate overall is roughly half the UK rate, 1/10 of the US rate. But there is a disproportionately high rate of domestic murder, and that has been put down to the fact that there just are a lot of guns in the house. So if there is a domestic argument, it's more likely to end in murder than
And in fact,
elsewhere.
the polls just before this referendum show that women were far more likely to support tighter gun controls than men, probably because of cases of domestic violence and the fact that women are more likely to be threatened with guns than men are.
But also, could it just be that Switzerland's kind of been lucky? I mean, you could have said these things about Norway or New Zealand before, couldn't you? That they seem like unified cultural places where this sort of thing doesn't happen, and then they had mass shootings there.
There has been one mass shooting in Switzerland in the early 2000s. A man killed, I think it was 14 people at a local canton parliament. I think that has shifted the tide a little bit. The number of guns in circulation has come down significantly since the early 2000s when Switzerland was second to, or rather it was third to the US and Yemen, which had the second highest gun ownership in the world. There has been a general shifting of opinion towards tighter controls on guns, not necessarily banning weapons, but certainly registering them and ensuring that the controls are stepped up.
There we are. I didn't think we'd get Yemen into the second story as well. Rebecca, is there a khat connection?
No, not quite. I think if you actually look at what's changed, not a lot has changed. Essentially, it just means that instead of being able to buy semi-automatics with all the usual safety checks they currently have, that Swiss people will have to get a special permit to buy a semi-automatic. So it's really not a huge change. What this is really about is Switzerland's relationship with the EU. This may sound familiar, but the Swiss government is currently in the process of trying to agree a framework for a future relationship between Switzerland and the EU. So these mandated changes are kind of sand in the craw of the anti-EU crowd in Switzerland. Most people there are favourable towards being in the Schengen area, but a recent poll showed that only 3% of Swiss people thought joining the EU was a feasible option for Switzerland.
A bit of a hit for the US gun lobby as well, actually, isn't it, Felicity? And we heard in that clip from The Daily Show them satirising that idea that, Americans who want to keep their guns might look to Switzerland for solace. But, I mean, it is another country off the map where they had a lot of guns and less control.
Yeah, but I'm not sure this story would even be on the radar of people in the US. So I'm not sure that there's going to be any sort of lessons to learn, or I just think it's not like a blueprint. I just think there's two completely different countries, two completely different cultures. I'm not sure there's going to be any.
It is often used, though, by the pro-gun lobby in the States as an argument for why guns shouldn't be controlled. And they say, look at Switzerland, they have this sort of almost crime-free society, and yet they have all of these weapons. So I think if this trend continued and these laws were tightened and they started to rule out sort of large categories of weapons, then that could take away an argument. Whether that will change people's minds in the States, I think, is an entirely different question.
They also have fewer of some of the divides that have typified countries that have succumbed to mass violence, haven't they? They don't have such a lot of immigration, so you haven't seen an Islamist attack, for example. They don't have such a big divide between rich and poor, so you don't see people, in ganglands in Switzerland, do you? I mean, all of that comes into play too.
Yeah, and it's just a small population too, so given that these events are fairly rare, just from a statistical basis, that it's less likely to happen there.
Okay, Felicity, you're up next after this, and just to warn listeners, we are going to be talking about swearing in the next section, so we will be swearing. That's after this. Felicity, what are you going to bring us to finish off with this week?
Holy shit, swearing is back, so see you next Tuesday.
Have you heard anything about Tommy Robinson running for MEP in the region?
Yeah, he's a cunt.
And why is that?
You know why, but she won't be asking.
That's why I'm asking. Can you give me... Why do you think that?
He's racist, he's Islamophobic, and he's a cunt.
And can you give me an example, though? Like what something he's said or done that shows that he's racist or Islamophobic?
Anything that comes out of his mouth is relatively bad. You know?
You guys know anything about Tommy Robinson running for MEP in the area? Why is he that word?
He deserves to have a milkshake thrown over him. He's just offensively offensive.
There was a video that went viral on Twitter of journalist Jessica Svitanowski asking Mancunians their opinions of their MEP candidate, Tommy Robinson. But we're not focusing on Mr. Robinson, we're focusing on the swearing. Felicity, why the fuck have you brought me this story?
Well, this video has gone viral partly because of the use of the word cunt in it. And it's prompted an opinion piece by Stan Carey in The Guardian, who's talking about, are we saying this word more frequently?
And are English people saying it more frequently? Because that was the interesting thing. Jessica Svitanowski on Twitter said, is this word less offensive than it is back home? Obviously, she's North American.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what comes out in this opinion piece that actually I hadn't realised, but in different, for some speakers, Australian English, Irish English, and British English, it's a sort of ordinary element of your speech, and it has a really, really long history, but it depends on where you are in parts of the world and the context of where swear words become offensive. But he also mentions Game of Thrones, which I haven't seen at all, but apparently they use the word a lot. So I think he's putting these things together and saying, is society now changing, and that we are seeing this word come up far more often, and is that okay or not?
Rebecca, this might be totally wrong, but in my mind, you're someone who's either highly offended by the C word or someone who uses it a lot, and I can't decide which you are, but I think you're one or the other. Which is it?
How exciting. I wouldn't say I was either.
Don't say you're middle ground.
I am middle ground. I mean, I use it on occasion.
Do you?
Yes. But I think the thing is, so in places like Scotland, Australia, people use it, there's actually linguists who have noticed in Scotland that people are starting to use the C word in place of pronouns. So instead of he, she, etc., you can just say cunt. But in some forms of speech, obviously not at the office.
Yeah.
But people just casually use it when they're talking about a friend or something to refer to them in the third person.
Like cunts on the phone. That kind of
exactly.
Thing. Right.
Whereas in the US, most people still find the word incredibly taboo. I wouldn't say people use it commonly in the UK generally, but in the US it's a real taboo. But the real division, I think, is that in the Commonwealth English use, you can use it to refer to anyone, and it's not gendered at all. I wouldn't say it was gendered at all. If anything, I'd say you'd use it to describe men slightly more than women.
But describing men as the C word in itself, if you're demeaning a man by calling him female genitalia, that's not necessarily the most feminist thing to do.
No, exactly. And, feminists have been making this argument for a long time, along with words, like bitch and pussy. They're often used to describe men who are, seen to be weak. But in the US, I think the reason the C word is so offensive is because it is almost exclusively used towards women. And it's kind of there. It's almost like an upgraded version of bitch. It's used to describe a certain kind of woman, like a woman who's seen as, bossy or, demanding, shrill, etc. And so it ties into all these negative female stereotypes.
There is a cultural shift, though, isn't there, in America, which I've observed just from watching sort of box sets and all the big TV shows. I have seen the C word be said a lot more often, and it's shocked me watching it, even though I use it in common currency with my friends. When I see an American character in an American TV show use it, it feels really weird because you're used to them saying fuck and motherfucker and all these things with the word fuck, but never that.
I think that's got a lot to do with the move from network TV to cable and especially HBO. And I think it was almost seen as such a freedom for writers that they just had to use it as much as they possibly could. I think in Game of Thrones, it feels like it makes sense, to the extent that anything in Game of Thrones makes sense, because the sort of setting for that story is meant to be this ancient warring kingdoms, and it feels as if that the sort of earthy Anglo-Saxon language just adds to the atmosphere of that setting.
Is it a good thing, Felicity, though, that we have become slightly desensitised to it and it's become more popularly used?
Personally, it doesn't really bother me, and I've always found swearing absolutely fascinating. And when you Google it, one book always comes up, which is Swearing is Good for You, The Amazing Science of Bad Language by Emma Byrne. And she did a lot of work into how swearing is really, really good for us. It can promote trust and teamwork in the office. It can increase our tolerance to pain. And actually, she helped kind of turn a lot of ideas on their heads. The idea that for a long time, we were told that swearing if you're in pain is actually really, really bad for you and it will increase the pain that you're in. And a behavioural psychologist called Richard Stevens decided to do a test on 67 volunteers who had to stick their hands in ice water. And some of them could use swear words and some of them couldn't. And on average, if you were swearing, you could keep your hand in the ice water for a lot longer. So it's actually the idea that it can increase your tolerance to pain. The only thing that slightly bothers me is that I feel there is a gender issue in terms of if you're a woman and you swear, I think you'll come under more fire and you'll be seen as more uncouth than if you're a bloke. But actually, I think women will swear more around blokes to kind of fit in with the kind of macho environment. And that's what Emma Byrne is something that she talks about. She would say that she would tend to swear as a way of marking herself as being more like her male colleagues.
It's interesting that you mention the office example, because last week we were talking about hugging cultures in work environments and how basically that maybe isn't a good idea, even though there are studies that say it is. I mean, with swearing in the office, I mean, it's one thing, isn't it? If you trap your finger in a door and you say shit, that's one thing. But if you're consistently effing and blinding whilst you're sitting at your desk, it can create an unpleasant environment for other people.
True, but I also suppose you can swear at someone as an attack, or you can swear as a sort of exclamation of pain or as a expression of, I don't know, solidarity in the workplace. You know, we're all fucked. I don't know, but there's a way that...
Intriguing that line comes to mind. Yeah.
But there's definitely a way that one of you could swear at me, where I'd be like, whoa, that's really offensive. And then you could just swear randomly and I'd be like, haha, you know.
That's kind of what it boils down to. I think kind of the innate prejudice some people have against hearing swearing does come down to almost kind of a survival instinct. If you hear someone ramping up their rhetoric, maybe by swearing, raising their voice, it does kick in a sort of feeling of like, you know, this kind of fight or flight sensation of, oh, is something about to kick off here? And I think that's one reason that people do continue, you know, there is still a large amount of people who object to the use of swearing in public. And I think that is because we're a small island, we have a lot of people mixing, and it's really important in public that we minimise aggression. That's why people, you know, we always joke about how non-confrontational people are on public transport, etc.
Yes.
And I think that's another element of that, is that we try and minimise aggression in public interaction.
And that's the thing, isn't it? If that taboo breaks down, I mean, it's interesting that this was a journalist asking people in the street what she thought. I think it's quite interesting that it was a sort of 21st century journalist. In other words, she had a smartphone. I think if she was there with a sort of cameraman and a sound guy as well, you know, and they were with the BBC or CNN, I doubt those people would have turned around and used that word.
Yeah, I think there is still that sense of respectability, and the fact that swearing undermines that sense of sort of, you know, genteel discourse. But a sister site in the US, theweek.com, ran an article this week called In Praise of Swearing, and it was discussing Trump's use of swearing in particular, and it's often been portrayed that these are gaffes or mistakes, but actually this article was suggesting that, look, this is a very deliberate strategy to build up that sort of solidarity that Felicity was talking about, and that what he's trying to say is that, you know, I'm a man of the people, I connect with you, I care about these things as much as you do. And so that's using swearing in a way of sort of, you know, inverting that respectability and saying, look, you know, that's not for me. I'm on your side.
But you can play with that, can't you, with that convention? You think about Jacob Rees-Mogg coming across as the sort of perfect gentleman, you know, whereas the Liberal Democrats coming under criticism this week for saying bollocks to Brexit. I mean, actually, people will say, oh, it doesn't matter what your argument is. If you've coarsened the language of it, you're the one demeaning the debate.
And I think it cuts through. There's something still, I think there is still a sort of prudish, British, tight upper lip type thing that, especially on social media, where you can just swear without actually having to say it to someone's face. But I think especially in politics, I mean, if Theresa May swore tomorrow, it would, you know, it's just one of those things.
I should say for the record that at the time of recording, Theresa May is Prime Minister. Yeah.
I think there's very definite grades of swearing as well. So Theresa May has sworn in the mildest form.
Has she?
She described herself as a bloody difficult woman using the Ken Clark phrase.
Yeah. The thing about my Brexit negotiations, you see, is I'm a cunt. I don't remember her saying that.
But no, I think, you know, if she used the C word, I think there would be genuine outrage
Yes.
about that.
It's just so unpopular anyway that they would just be used as it's not to do with the word itself. It's just because people don't really like her anymore.
I think that would certainly be part of it, but I think that word itself still does have a power to it. And it's interesting the journey that word has taken, because it used to be used very widely, and according to James MacDonald, who wrote the Wordsworth Dictionary of Obscenity and Taboo, the C word was used to refer to the vagina without embarrassment or vulgarity until the end of the 14th century.
Yeah.
And you can kind of sense that from Chaucer, who was writing towards the end of the 14th century, and he used a very similar sounding word, cainta. Apparently this is actually a different word, meaning an intricate device or a pleasing thing. But the context he used...
It was the same. I remember the Miller's Tale. I did it for A-level. He grabbed her by the quente.
There's some argument about to what extent he's using the same word or a different word with a slight... But, the context now leaves very little to the imagination. I have my own Middle English quote from Chaucer, which I will attempt to do.
I mean, if Holden's ever going to finish the show, it's going to be with some Chaucerian Middle English. Go for it.
This is from The Wife of Bath's Tale.
Yeah.
For certain all the dotard by your lever, you shall have kente right enough at ever.
There we go. Current Affairs podcast, everyone. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity, Capon, Holden, Frith, and fucking Rebecca Gillie. Never miss an episode when you subscribe to this show. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and hit subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Chica Ayres at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.